Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frank Janussi. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Mansfield Foundation. For those who are here enjoying bento box, for those online who are tuning in for some intellectual nourishment, we hope, even if it's not physical nourishment for your bodies. One of the great pleasures of working at the Mansfield Foundation is the opportunity to listen to smart people talk about things that they're passionate about. So this afternoon, we've got three smart people talking about things that they are both passionate about and deeply expert in. And so I'm looking forward to a very lively and nourishing afternoon. I want to say a couple of words about the foundation to those of you who may not know who we are. The Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation was actually created by an act of Congress 41 years ago. We've just passed our 40th anniversary. And the Congress wanted to honor the service of Maureen and Mike Mansfield to the nation. I like to tell people who don't know anything about Maureen and Mike that they are the most important people that you've never heard of. Maureen, because she utterly transformed Mike's life and set him on a course that would be very different than that which he was set upon as a private from the Marine Corps working as a copper miner in Montana when they met. And Mike, because he was the longest serving Senate Majority Leader in the history of the nation, also the longest serving U.S. ambassador anywhere, any place in the history of the United States, 11 years of service in Tokyo. And it was under his watch as Senate Majority Leader that we get the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and Title IX for women's education. And it's under his watch as ambassador that we get the 123 nuclear agreement with Japan, that we get set in motion a resolution to the bitter trade and economic disputes that were the hallmark of his time in the 1980s in the U.S.-Japan relationship. And really set in motion the transformation of that relationship that we are enjoying today at a time where U.S. and Japan relations are much closer economically, and I would argue maybe even strategically than at any point since the end of World War II. Maureen Mansfield comes first in the name of our foundation at the request of Mike. Because he recognized that her transformative role. Mike left school in 14 years of age, ran away from home to join the Navy, never finished high school, never went to college until much later. And after serving in the Pacific as a Marine, he came back with the rank of private. And there's a story there. I don't know the full story, but if you serve in the Marine Corps for 4 or 5 years and you leave as a private, you must have done something bad. So I want to know more about how that happened. But he comes as a private to Montana, and he's mucking ore in a copper mine. He's shoveling ore into buckets when he meets Maureen, who's a school teacher, well-to-do, a daughter of a banker, and they fall in love. They go dancing in the dance hall. Their favorite dance is Tea for Two, is their song. And he's on her dance card. And he wants to marry her, and she won't marry him because he has no education, and his aspiration to be a copper miner in Chile does not align with her aspirations of the kind of life that she wants with him. And she encourages him to go back to school. And he's like, well, that's very nice, Maureen, but I got no money. I'm a private, retired from the, discharged from the Marine Corps, and I'm a copper miner. I can't afford to go to school. She cashes in her life insurance policy with $1,000 cash value to pay for his education, and before they're married. He goes back to school. He gets his high school equivalency. He gets his college degree. He gets a master's degree in East Asian Studies at the University of Montana. And then she says, okay, now I'll marry you. And it changes his life, and it changes their lives together. So it's a wonderful story. He goes on to serve in the House and then the Senate and as ambassador. But none of it's possible without Maureen. So I always like to tell people that story, which is why her name comes first. Now, this afternoon's lunch seminar is sponsored by the Embassy of Japan. I want to thank the Embassy of Japan for their support of the Mansfield Foundation, not just for this lunchtime seminar, but for all the good work that we do in fostering a closer partnership. Today's event is on the record and will be recorded so that we can share some of the brilliance of our speakers later. It's part of a series of programs that the Mansfield Foundation will run this year, reaching out to thought leaders, people who care about the U.S. relationships in East Asia, to help bring important analysis to light. I'm not expert on economics, but we have three people to share with you their views on the U.S.-Japan economic cooperation prospects for the year ahead. So think of this as a scene setter for 2024. And to help us set that scene, we have three wonderful scholars, and they will speak in this order, and I will not exhaustively introduce them to save time for our program. Their bios are on your program, but we have Kyla Kitamura, who is analyst on international trade and finance at the Congressional Research Service. Congressional Research Service is the legislative research arm of Congress. It is the place in which resides true, deep expertise to augment the energy of congressional staff who work on committees and for members of Congress. It's a nonpartisan research arm. They produce excellent analyses of events in the world and what's happening in the world for members of Congress and their staff. They help prepare for hearings. They help to inform the general public. Kitamura-san will speak first and give us a little bit of an overview about the issues in U.S.-Japan economic cooperation in the year ahead. Then we have Dr. Saori Katada. Katada-san teaches at the University of Southern California. Her main, well, she's written lots of books, but her main book, Japan's New Regional Reality Geoeconomic Strategy in the Asia-Pacific, came out in July 2020. Laying out, scoping out Japan's Abe-inspired economic outreach to the entirety of the Indo-Pacific. And then our final speaker, Dr. Mireya Solís, is the director of the Center for East Asian Policy Studies and the Philip Knight Chair of Japan Studies at the Brookings Institution. Mireya, I think, is the only one of the three who is a member of our Network for the Future, or am I right? I am. Yes. So the Japan Foundation inspired Network for the Future here at the Mansfield Foundation has been involved in nurturing the intersection of scholarship and public policy for the better part of a decade. And Mireya was in class one. So we still consider you, Dr. Solís, to be part of the future, but you are now, I'm sad to report, an established expert in Washington, D.C. So as a member of Class 1 of the Network for the Future, we celebrate Dr. Solís for a long affiliation with the Mansfield Foundation. With that preliminary, I will say one last word about the U.S.-Japan relationship, which is that, as I mentioned, at the time of Mansfield, there was an awful lot of tension. Trade deficits, intellectual property disputes, concerns about subsidies, undercutting, dumping. Most, but not all of those issues have been resolved in the subsequent 40 years. But there's a whole raft of new and emerging issues on the horizon or with us today. In the IT sphere, in cyber and space, in how the U.S. and Japan are going to work together globally to foster a rules-based international order on trade at a time when many of the institutions upon which we have relied traditionally to do that work, like the World Trade Organization, are either in disarray or in decline or dysfunctional for one reason or another. And so the U.S.-Japan in the world is still a major economic challenge, but there are also bilateral issues that need our attention as well. And I hope that we'll be able to get into those. For those of you online, there is an opportunity for you to pose questions of our speakers. Please post those in the chat box or the question box online on Zoom, and they will be relayed to me via some miraculous electronic thing called a cell phone. So without further ado, let me please turn to Kitamura-san for your opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Frank, for that lovely introduction. And thank you for the invitation to speak with you all today. I'm just really honored to be on the panel with Dr. Katada and Dr. Solís. So thank you so much for the opportunity to join. So just a note at the outset regarding the Congressional Research Service, Frank already covered our role, but just a reminder that we work solely for the US Congress and don't take any positions on legislation or policy options or administration actions. So getting that out of the way, just a few broad remarks to get us started. I was struck by Frank mentioning the history of US-Japan trade relations, and building off of that, today, I think US government officials and stakeholders broadly understand the importance of engaging with the Indo-Pacific and Japan in particular from both an economic and security standpoint. So today we're talking about the economics, the trade angle. So they understand the importance of engagement. However, the lack of internal political consensus within the United States about what trade policy should look like has made engagement in wide-ranging trade initiatives in the region and comprehensive free trade agreements politically difficult. So generally, over the last few years, the U.S. approach to trade policy has shifted towards prioritizing more targeted, executive-led trade initiatives. And this has shaped U.S. engagement with both Japan and the Indo-Pacific region as a whole. The launch of IPEF, which I believe was in the event description, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. So that was a Biden administration initiative that was launched, and it's an executive-led initiative. And this was likely in response to concerns from US stakeholders, as well as partners in the region about US engagement, economically speaking, in the region following the withdrawal from TPP. So 3 of the partner countries in IPEF were top 10 US trading partners in 2022. That's Japan, South Korea, and India. And US trade with Vietnam, another IPEF partner, has grown by more than 400% over the last decade. So the economic case is there, right? IPEF partners signed a supply chain agreement last year, announced the conclusion of agreements in clean energy, tax and anti-corruption, other issues. But they were unable to come to an agreement under the trade portion of the talks at the sidelines of the APEC summit in November. They've indicated that trade talks will continue, but I hinted at the political situation in the United States, and that is even more difficult in a presidential election year like 2024. So meanwhile, trade agreements in the rest of the world have not stood still. CPTPP, which is a successor to the Trade Trans-Pacific Partnership, and RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, have gone into force in that region without US participation. And China is a member of RCEP, and they've expressed interest in joining CPTPP as well. In addition, Indo-Pacific countries are engaging in various trade initiatives among each other and with trading partners like the European Union as well. So amid this landscape, the US-Japan relationship, I believe, is a key anchor for US economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. In addition to being major trading partners, Japan is the top source of foreign direct investment in the United States, and vice versa, the US is the top investor in Japan as well. So this robustness of the US-Japan economic relationship creates room and incentives for creative solutions and frameworks to maintain trade policy momentum. And the country's shared economic interests and values drive their partnership on issues like supply chain resiliency or economic coercion, non-market policies and practices through various bilateral, regional, and plurilateral initiatives. So one example I'll be focusing on today, an area I work on, is the US-Japan Critical Minerals Agreement, which was signed last March. So to provide some context about critical minerals agreements, those discussions grew out of US trading partners' concerns with electric vehicle or EV tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. So related specifically to critical minerals, there was a rule stating that a certain percentage of the critical minerals in the EV battery must be sourced from the United States or from its free trade agreement partners. So this has spurred a lot of debate of what we mean by free trade agreement, because free trade agreement is not defined in statute. So industry stakeholders and U.S. trading partners call on the administration to take a broad view of what free trade agreement means, so that a larger number of countries could participate in the supply chain, and we could, broaden the sources of critical minerals for this purpose. So following the conclusion of the U.S.-Japan Critical Minerals Agreement, which is the first and so far only of its type, the Biden administration designated Japan as a free trade agreement partner for the purposes of this tax credit. And Japan is the only one in this sort of separate category compared to our comprehensive free trade agreement partners. So this allows Japanese critical minerals, particularly processed critical minerals like cobalt, which Japan does source to the US, to participate in this percentage requirements. But more broadly, this was a meaningful signal for the US-Japan economic relationship, given that the foreign direct investment that I mentioned, a large portion of that is in the automotive sector in the United States. So Japanese firms have been making various announcements related to EV manufacturing and EV battery manufacturing over the last few years as well. So talked about IPEF, talked about the critical minerals agreement. This brings me to the role of Congress in all of this. I noted earlier that there's been a shift towards targeted executive-led trade initiatives. With past comprehensive free trade agreements, Congress authorized negotiating objectives. They authorized and approved the agreement through legislation. And so far, this has not been the case with either IPEF or with the Critical Minerals Agreement. Many members of Congress have expressed their dissatisfaction with this role in recent trade initiatives. And some members spoke out publicly, for example, specifically about the US-Japan Critical Minerals Agreement and the designation of Japan as a free trade agreement partner without approval from Congress. Some members also publicly opposed including a trade agreement or concluding a trade agreement under IPEF rather publicly ahead of the APEC summit, and this likely contributed to the talks stalling as well. So the debate over the trade policy roles of Congress and the White House is a key consideration when thinking about future cooperation, and particularly when thinking about the durability of these initiatives across time and across administrations. So to that end, in 2024, I will be watching the implementation of the IPEF agreements that have already been concluded to see to what extent can IPEF partners institutionalize these agreements, get the processes off the ground. Can they make IPEF's potential benefits tangible to stakeholders? And will they be able to make any progress in the trade pillar this year, despite that difficult political environment that I described? So the answers to these questions may have implications for the durability of IPEF going forward. Another area I'm interested in watching this year is US-Japan supply chain cooperation more broadly. There's been a lot of talk about friendshoring supply chains. I'm not sure how familiar you all are with that term, but for example, related to EV batteries and critical minerals, just developing sourcing among countries with shared values, shared interests. That could be one description of friendshoring. So the EV tax credit requirements, the critical minerals agreement fit into this discussion, but there are also broader initiatives like discussions about critical minerals under IPEF, for example, or the Mineral Security Partnership, which is a US State Department-led initiative. So to what extent will we be seeing results from these initiatives in this year? Will they be successful in upholding shared values and also maintaining or supporting industry competitiveness in this area? And one other question of note in this section, will there be constraints on friendshoring, on sourcing from countries like Japan related to political or national security concerns? So in closing, there are opportunities and incentives for the US and Japan to strengthen their trade relationship, to make progress in the trade arena this year, but there are also some potential headwinds. So how will the two countries navigate these issues? And can the US and Japan further cement their shared leadership on tackling global challenges? So I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Kitamura-san. My key takeaways from your presentation so far, one is that IPEF is what we make it. So you noted some progress in IPEF on energy and other issues, climate, but you also noted where it had failed to make momentum, and you cited good reasons for it, including the breakdown of the consensus on free trade policies and commitments in the United States and the political divisions here, and also maybe some skepticism on the part of Congress, even about how aggressively the Biden administration should use its executive authority to try to use IPEF in the trade sphere. But then you also highlighted the importance of critical minerals and supply chain resiliency. And when we come back in Q&A, I want to pursue that further because, as you hinted, it's much bigger than just U.S.-Japan. It's Australia, it's Indonesia, it's all of the potential alternative sources other than China for critical minerals. China still has a stranglehold on 70% or more of the critical mineral supply globally. But it matters which minerals we're talking about and then who the friends are. I look forward to more. Katada-san, please. And now turning to you, we can begin to telescope in a little bit, I suspect, from Kitamura-san's wonderful overview.
Thank you. So, well, thank you very much. And it's an honor to be here in Washington, D.C. I am from sunny LA, but it's nice to see some kind of a winter weather for a short while. I'm
Emphasis on short.
Short while, sorry. I'm really honored to be with Mireya, my really good friend for a long time, and Kyla, I'm meeting for the first time, but really excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Frank, and all the Mansfield Foundation. It's really wonderful to be here. So my task is kind of looking at more the U.S.-Japan economic cooperation in 2024, contextualizing what's going on. And since my expertise is more on the Japan side, probably in my perspective, reflect on what Japan is trying to get at. But in any case, the global economy, 2024 would be a critical year. Well, is a critical year. We are already there now in various ways. And obviously, the challenges have been foreshadowed by things that were going on in 2023 and even some of them earlier. So geopolitical conflict in various places, Ukraine, first of all, for 2 years now, or 2 years going forward now, more than that. And then now the conflict in Middle East, Gaza, and it's not only there, but in multiple places. And all that is not only military security issues, but it has had major impact on supply chains and various ways from logistics to energy to food supply. So all that is a crucial backdrop for the global economy. In addition, and everybody's now looking at this, is the slowdown of the Chinese economy. Everybody's now worried about, is China going to be like Japan, that deflation is starting, it's going to last for a long time, or is it going to come back? And obviously, given the kind of Chinese political system, everybody's worried whether they could come back from the debt, public debt, and then not. But again, the government is not bailing out some of these major corporations at this point, so we have to watch this very carefully. In some ways, this has some blessing these days, like to Japan or some other Southeast Asian countries, where a lot of investment are diverted to these areas, so that the stock market in Japan is going up and things like that. But in the long run, this is a really concerning development moving forward. And in addition to all these, both geopolitical and geoeconomic, there is this particular thing for this year that from the report, there are 70 plus countries going through election this year, including kind of yours truly, the United States. So all those are a place where things can change drastically. Obviously, American election is quite crucial in that sense, but in other countries, even including Ukraine, is going through the election this year. From Japan to 2024 is a critical year. You might be hearing about this 2024 problem, where the Japan's Labor Standard Act is revised, and as of April, there is a limit for the overtime for the workers. And that will kick in. And many the essential workers in some ways, like the truck drivers or nursing care nurses, will have faced this kind of limit as to how much they can work overtime. And this will really kick in a significant labor shortage, which Japan is already suffering for the last about a decade, I would say, or even more. The other thing that's going on in Japan, and that probably will see a critical juncture in 2024, is the monetary policy. You might be hearing from the fact that the governor, the BOJ, Bank of Japan governor, Ueda, is flirting or maybe signaling the idea of Japanese monetary policy finally changing after 11 years in order to kind of get out of the negative interest rate and maybe trickling a bit of the interest rate up. And obviously for Japan, it's really interesting, for the last 30 years that I've been, with Frank in looking at Japan-US history, weekend has been a blessing for Japan forever and ever. Now people are worried about it because of inflation, because of the high energy and food costs, and things are, and people traveling and then doing things outside really is affecting them quite negatively. So it might change some of that dynamics on one side, but also another concerning factor in the monetary policy is that this will affect the fiscal sustainability of Japanese government debt. As you know, that there's a 260% public debt in Japan is 260% also of GDP. And many of the things are sustained because of the fiscal resources that Japanese government is able to dole out. So this might be another element that we have to watch for in terms of the Japanese domestic economic turn. And finally, and you probably be hearing on the news that the political problems the Japanese government is having with the slush fund, LDP, all that is raising some impact on economy, where various ministers who are critical for Japan's foreign economic policies dealing with the United States many of them had to resign due to that. This has changed whole dynamics of the Kishida administration, given the changes that was imposed on him. So all that, all to make the point that 2024 is a critical year for both Japan and the world, and definitely for the United States. So at the remaining time I have, I would like to make 3 points related to the economic cooperation and how US and Japan will continue to be an important partners. But at the same time, there are some things to watch out for in terms of concerns and challenges these both countries and its relationship would face or would likely to face moving into 2024. Again, keep saying moving into, we are in 2024. The first point is about how to maintain the rule-based global trade order overall. And US and Japan obviously are the key players in this. On the Japan side, obviously the success conclusion of CPTPP, it's been 5 years, so almost 5.5 years since it's been in force. And that's been a significant kudos for Japanese leadership in maintaining this rule-based order of global trade. Now, UK has just joined this summer. So the UK is the 12th member of CPTPP, and many, as Kyla was talking about, are wanting to join or have applied to join, including the ones who applied, China and Taiwan. Others include places like Uruguay, Costa Rica, Ukraine, I heard, Ecuador, and then South Korea, Thailand, and various others. So this is a sign that there is a thirst for this rule-based order and some mechanism that would actually maintain that as an institution. So the decision as to how all the members have to agree to access whoever is a new applicant, so whether to let China in anytime soon is a very critical part of what's going on now into the future, in the recent future. The other thing is obviously IPEF. Again, Kyra has already mentioned quite a bit about it, not repeat too much on it, but the clean economy pillar has been agreed. Millions of dollars of decarbonization fund has been established between Japan, Australia, and United States in support of the global South. Also there is a kind of a fair trade pillar agreed. I will talk about the supply chain in a minute. But obviously, the concern is that trade pillar was not reached agreement, mostly, if I understand the report correctly, due to the American domestic politics. So that's the kind of key point that is really a concerning part. And the digital economy, that is the crucial component of the trade, is now shifted to other places. And I've been hearing that Japan is trying to utilize OECD for its standard setting platform. So this is the overall the U.S.-Japan cooperation. So far doing very well, but obviously Japan wants the U.S. to come back to TPP, and Mireya might have some insights on that. It doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon, or if ever. The second point I would like to make is about supply chains, supply chain resilience, and economic security issues attached to it. Obviously, how important it is demonstrated by the fact that within the IPEF 4 pillars, supply chain is the one that got agreed in advance in an accelerated pace. So overall, this demonstrates the kind of critical feature of how critical this feature of the IPEF is within this rule-based order and for the membership. Obviously, Kyla has already talked about critical mineral agreement, which is kind of putting Japan and US on the same platform. And also, there has been the kind of discussion and agreement in the cutting edge technology supply chain between Japan and the United States at the Economic 2+2 meeting in November. So overall, there are a lot of kind of eye-to-eye, very kind of on the same page cooperation between Japan and United States on this, even including some of the technology alliance on the semiconductors and export control, friendshoring type of activities. Japan also, on its own sake, introduced or installed economic security promotion law back in May of 2022, right? So year and a half ago. And many of the, they have 4 pillars too, but many of the pillars are now being implemented through this year, last year and this year. So supply chain, critical infrastructure, R&D and patent and so on. So altogether, this seems to be a good place that collaboration would continue between Japan and the United States in support of the rule-based order. The challenges exist though, that Japan and US do not see eye to eye or do not agree with each other in terms of how they the respective governments will deal with the businesses. In some ways, Japan's action towards the businesses is much more to do with the carrots, I would like to say, while there's a lot of sticks associated with the US, not only for the American corporations, but the corporations doing business with the United States. Also, the difference here is the relationship with China. Obviously, Japan is, even though slowing down the Chinese economy per se is actually starting some of the reshoring or friendshoring actions on the part of Japanese businesses, but there is, China still continues to be a very significant market and a customer for Japan. So how quickly or how much Japan will push forward all these activities is a questionable thing compared to the United States. So the last point, I would like to kind of list several things that I think are the things to watch out for, but this is my, professor take, so I might be totally offline, but still. So obviously the election is a critical thing that watch out for, American election, but there might be an election in Japan taking place in the fall, where Kishida government's approval rate is really low, but maybe this will be a time to kick in after the party presidential election, which is taking place September of this year. So once, whoever is becoming the president of the LDP, he usually, I don't think there'll be a she, but he would be the one that looking to going into an election, the lower house that would determine the politics moving forward. Meanwhile, definitely another thing that everybody's probably put on the table is the technology, AI, and various things that has changed the production process quite significantly in the US. I'm hearing the productivity is now quite significantly up in the US, which is a good thing. Meanwhile, this might have a dislocation in terms of employment and things like that. Related to the United States, the U.S. Industrial policy and protectionism, like the case of the Inflation Reduction Act and all those, Japan so far has been honored member of this, but how long this could continue without Japan being part of the target is a kind of a concern. On the Japanese side, I think it's really something to watch is the Japanese energy transition. So that was one of the things that US and other G7 countries were not in agreement where energy transition and the decarbonization or the green economy were pushed really strongly forward by the non-Japan G7, while Japan is promoting this so-called various pathways to the energy transition, not only for its own country, but for Asia. So this difference in views might really impact the collaboration moving forward. Finally, I would like to say another thing to watch out for is this Counter Economic Coercion Act that I think it's kind of moving through the Congress, if I understand it correctly, in the United States. No, that kind of agreement, the announcement, the declaration was done in G7 in Hiroshima, but how far is it going to go, how Japan responds to it, how other countries respond to it will be very, very interesting thing to watch. Obviously, finally, the infrastructure and all debt overhang will be something really important in 2024 and a few other years after that. But I would like to conclude here by saying that, yes, the American election is really, really crucial for the global economy and for Japan-US relationship for the 2024. But Japan will continue to work as a glue that will keep this liberal economic order together for the time being, as US figures out some ways that will be an active way to support as a trading nation of the global order in trade. Thank you.
Thank you, Katada Sensei. I learned a lot from your remarks, and I'm putting things on my radar to watch for 2024. One is China's slowdown or resiliency, because markets hate uncertainty, and the global markets don't want to see a Chinese slowdown, but it may be coming, and that could have real consequences. Related issue that you highlighted is that Japan and US don't see China identically. We share many values and orientation and concerns, but there are differences. And those differences could become more acute, depending on how aggressively the US pushes the selective decoupling or de-risking, or however we want to describe the limits that the US Congress and the administration are placing on the US-China relationship. There could be some tension there. Your World Bank training and experience is showing, because you highlighted some of the monetary issues that are relevant for Japan. And I appreciate your putting those on the table, including the weak yen, which is of great benefit to the Mansfield Foundation, but not necessarily of long-term benefit to the people of Japan. And we should be alert to the potential of change there. I will instruct our Director of Communications to please erase all remarks about Japanese overtime pay. My team in Tokyo is sleeping right now. I don't want them to be aware that they should be potentially coming to the foundation for overtime pay. You have set up well, I think, Mireya, whose book, Japan's Quiet Leadership, Reshaping the Indo-Pacific, is just out. And I've not read it yet, but I look forward to reading it because, Katada-san, you have laid out a scenario in which the rules-based order is one that really Japan is shouldering a remarkable degree of leadership right now at a time when the United States consensus on free trade in particular, but on trade agreements in general, is not present. And where American leadership is maybe not as robust as it has been in the past. So I want to turn now to Dr. Solís to learn more about Japan's role in the global economy, and maybe also the U.S. perspective to complement Katada-san's analysis from a Tokyo perspective.
Great. Thank you very much, Frank, and the Mansfield Foundation for the invitation. It's always wonderful to be here, and thank you everybody for joining this conversation. I think the previous speakers covered so much ground and they did so well that I find it hard to find things to say that sound fresh and new. I'm mostly going to be emphasizing many of the themes that they have highlighted, but hopefully put them in a little with more detail or a little bit different light. But I think I'm very much in agreement with everything that has been said. And I thought, Frank, for these my initial remarks, that I would just frame them following a basic question, and that is, what are the prospects for U.S.-Japan cooperation at a time when we know that the geoeconomic agenda is becoming more and more important, but also at a time as Saori mentioned, when we know that domestic political constraints are going to be front and center. So it's the intersection of both the geoeconomic, the geopolitics, but also how these political constraints this year in particular are going to bite. Where does that leave the US-Japan economic agenda for this year and going forward? So following then that initial question, then I'm going to organize my comments in a very simple way, talking about why the geoeconomics is so important. How do I see domestic politics making and having an impact on how these countries maneuver in sorting out their foreign economic policy? And is this good news or bad news for the bilateral and plurilateral economic agenda? And what role can we expect Japan and the United States to play in the near future? So let me then start by articulating why I think that foreign economic policy is indeed high politics. You know, when I was a grad student, we used to hear that the economic issues, trade issues were low politics, and it was really war and peace, national security, that's what merited most attention, and that was high politics. And you can probably guess, because of the track I followed, that I never really believed that, and I think that my fellow panelists didn't either, in the sense that we all specialized on international political economy. And the way I see it is that trade policy has always been high politics and has always been difficult because it touches very closely on domestic politics. It's really at that intersection. But when we think about trade policy as foreign policy, you can see why the connections are very clear, because it's about diplomacy. It's about the assertion of international influence. Countries, states that are able to articulate the vision for regional integration, that can pool efforts to codify and disseminate new rules on trade and investment, that can deepen partnerships with selected partners. Those are exercises of influence, of diplomacy, and of leadership. And I worry, to be quite frank, I'm giving away where I stand, but I think it's very clear for many here that the US has lost sight of this, because negotiating comprehensive trade agreements with tariff liberalization is still an essential way in which we should expect countries to try to step up and be more influential. But anyway, that has always been a way in which I think trade policy has been a great consequence to foreign policy. But I would be remiss if I don't note that, of course, the influence, the impact, the stakes of foreign economic policy have grown of late because of what we're witnessing today, which is a fusion of economics and national security. The agendas have become now closer. And we always now, when we look at a specific issue in foreign economic policy, ask, what are the national security implications? That was not necessarily always so front and center, and this is certainly happening today. Why? I mentioned in the past what I see as the main drivers of the rise of economic security, this fusion of economics and national security. First of all, clearly the US-China strategic competition that is being waged in many ways through economic tools. Also because we're in the midst of a technological revolution, and therefore we are developing very rapidly artificial intelligence, microelectronics, edge computing, biotechnologies, clean energy, you name it. So this means that the technological frontier is moving very quickly, but also that many of these technologies are referred to as platform technologies because they matter greatly for economic competitiveness and military modernization. And therefore you begin to see again another very strong rationale for why economics and national security now are arm to arm walking together. Add to that this growing sense of vulnerability that we're experiencing because our supply chains, we went through a global supply chain revolution. The world really integrated more deeply through these production links, trade links, information links, but they have been under stress. And it seems like supply chains cannot catch a break. Every time we think that we have overcome the latest hurdle, we find that there's another major shock to the system. It started, of course, with the pandemic, then the war in Europe, now tension in the Middle East, the Red Sea situation also making very hard for shipping in that area. And of course, in the Indo-Pacific, the hotspots, the Korea Peninsula and the Taiwan Straits, we're very worried about what may happen there. So again, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of risk. And you could say that summarizing is that the risk environment has intensified dramatically. And that is, I think, driving many countries, many governments, including the United States and Japan, to develop very rapidly new tools or to redesign existing tools. And of course, trade is essential, but we now see that on the economic security front, we see a lot of action on export control, on supply chain resilience initiatives, the comeback of industrial policy. Remember the old Washington consensus where industrial policy was bad? Well, now we are very strong practitioners of industrial policy. Just to name a few of these new, and of course, oversight of foreign direct investment with a national security lens. That is also growing, not only an inbound investment, but also now outbound investment. So economic security is, of course, high politics because it's the a main arena through which the United States and China, as I said, are managing their competition, but also because the United States is trying to build what I would refer to as economic security coalitions. And that is the United States, I think, is right that it doesn't always execute it, but at least I think conceptually, that it cannot advance, cannot succeed in its economic security agenda if it does not have partners. So when we think about economic security, we usually think about protection of core technology, promotion of advanced manufacturing, new industries, new technologies, but of course, partnering is essential because the United States does not control all the key nodes in very sophisticated supply chains, because if we really want to diversify away from China, we need to be working with others. So I think that Japan clearly plays an essential role on this partnering effort. And I think that the United States is aware of this, but I would, as you will notice in my following remarks, does not execute well on the partner realm, or not well enough. And there's work to do there. So that just goes to the first of the three main elements I want to touch on today, and that is why foreign economic policy is so central to foreign policy, to geopolitics, and where are the new trends there. But this is a very interesting year, as Saori mentioned, because it's a year when domestic politics are going to be in front of so many national leaders, so many publics are going to the polls. And this matters to trade and foreign economic policy because, as I mentioned before, this is an area where we know specifically, especially in trade, that domestic political constraints loom large. What I find really interesting going to, we're all 30 years ago and we're looking back, what it's really interesting, not going 30 years back, but a few years back, that it has become clear that domestic politics are a very significant constraint in the United States for the exercise of trade leadership, not so much anymore on Japan. Japan broke the shackles, if you will, of domestic politics and was able to up its game and, CPTPP and TPP, CTPP, and many other initiatives are proof that Japan can do much more than it could in the past. Whereas in the United States, we are now really struggling to articulate an ambitious trade agenda. Seems like we have given up, if I may be so bold to say. And do we just have to look back at, the last presidential election when the Trans-Pacific Partnership became a political orphan? There was no candidate who was willing to vouch for it. We can also look at the fact that during the Trump administration, there was this major resort to tariffs as a magic one that would solve all kinds of problems. And certainly the tariffs on China, very substantive, very hefty. And those tariffs have been maintained by the Biden administration. Now you're also seeing some of the economic initiatives that have been negotiated in the past few years, increasing use to, quite frankly, protectionist devices by, Buy American clauses or stiffer requirements for North American assembly, for example, and all these requirements that we're imposing for countries to be able to sell here, they have to produce here, and so forth. So it's clear that the United States, and we hear this, the Biden administration and certainly the Trump administration have been very explicit that they do not want to embark on anything like the TPP or any tariff across-the-board tariff reduction exercise. And of course, the question is, well, this happened in 2016, 2017. This is the trend we are. How are we going to do this year that we are facing a new presidential election? And I would say that if, if you're a trade hand, it's not a very pretty picture. Because, when you look at what the candidates, the record is and what they say, it's not great for trade liberalization. For example, Trump has already made some comments as to what he would do if he wins the election this time and he comes back. And, he's talking about a 10% across the board tariff against all countries, including our friends, including our partners, all industries, and 60% tariff against goods from China. Now, he also has said that if he wins the election, IPEF is gone, poof. And that's a problem with executive agreements that, by the stroke of a pen, you can get them signed once the negotiation is finished, but they can also be torn apart easily. You don't have Congress stepping in and say, wait a minute. Trump says that IPEF is TVP 2.0, whereas in fact, actually, the two initiatives could not be more different. But we get a taste of what would happen. But I would also say that electoral considerations are influencing how Democrats and the Biden administration are positioning themselves on the trade and foreign economic policy agenda. And this is an example that has been remarked on and by all the speakers today, but there's a reason for taking note of this. I think that the most telling episode is what happened at the APEC summit, a meeting last November, when just a few days going into the meeting, the expectation was on the Pillar 1, which is about trade facilitation, but also labor standards, digital standards, that there would be an early harvest agreement. It was clear that negotiations were not going to wrap, but there would be deliverables. But on the eve of announcing this, the Biden administration decided to suspend that, so there would not be any agreement announced. And also just a few days before that, the Biden administration decided to suspend the digital negotiations in IPEF. And this is very concerning for a number of reasons that I'll be brief in elaborating. First, on the labor standards, it became clear that there was pushback from some influential Democratic senators who felt that there was not enough progress in having ambitious binding labor standards, and it was therefore better not to have anything at all. And in terms of the digital economy, this is really, I think, worrisome because this is one of the areas where we are in desperate need for international rules. Our economies are turning more and more digitized, but we don't have good comprehensive rules on this, and where the United States and Japan have tried to provide them. And the U.S. has a track record with the U.S.-Japan Digital Trade Agreement, with a digital economy chapter in the USMCA. But the United States very suddenly decided to do a U-turn and to step in the WTO's e-commerce negotiations, suspend negotiations. It would no longer push for some core principles that would be part of this agreement, which are freedom of data flows, bans on data localization requirements, and bans on the forced transfer of source code. So without really a lot of consultation with stakeholders and almost out of the blue, the United States did this U-turn on digital policy and suspended digital negotiations on IPEF. So why is this problematic? Well, I'll get into that in a second, but let me just to wrap up the discussion, and clearly domestic politics play here, because again, the digital economy, there was pushback also inside the Democratic base as to not move forward on this agenda. I would concur with what has been said about that domestic politics matter in Japan as well in this year too. It's not that I see an anti-trade backlash like we see in the United States, but it's true that there's a lot of uncertainty as to what happens next. This scandal that about not properly reporting fundraising that came from hosting parties, and the broader discussion it has triggered about the role of factions in the LDP, and the attempts of Prime Minister Kishida to put forward an interim report on political reform does hint at more fluidity in Japanese politics. 3 major factions, 4 actually, have now disbanded. others will remain. And this happens in months ahead of that very important party election of the LDP. This means that when Prime Minister Kishida comes to Washington in April, both he and Biden will be more preoccupied by the domestic political situation than in previous meetings they've had, for very different reasons. But I do think that it begins to show that this is a year where domestic politics will be very present. Now, where does this leave us on the U.S.-Japan economic cooperation? Let me start with the bad news and then try to make my way to better news. I think that, unfortunately, from what I'm saying, I think it follows that in some important ways, on the trade agenda, there is a narrowing of the scope of cooperation. And I certainly think it is concerning. Why say this? Well, mostly because of what has transpired on digital economy rules and the fact that the United States is not working in tandem or together with Japan, as it was doing in the past, in advancing these freedom of data flows principles. The United States is now saying we need policy space. We're not going to decide right away. We're now doing consultations and they're standing still. But as we said by others in the panel, everyone else is moving in negotiating their own rules or in trying to disseminate rules about digital protectionism. So that's certainly concerning. Second, from a point of view of Tokyo, IPEF has always Plan B. Plan A was CPTPP. Now the question is, I think, from the point of view of Tokyo and others, do we need a Plan C? Because with IPEF, I think it's very, very difficult that Pillar 1 will achieve a conclusion in 2024. The domestic politics are not going to allow it. As others have said, the other three pillars have been signed and work, they could be useful, but a lot of the language of IPEF is voluntary, aspirational, and it's about process. It's about setting committees that will think through how we advance cooperation. So it's not the most tight form of let's work together. It's very it's a soft mechanism to deliver these cooperation. And I think that this is not just Japan, but the problem with where IPEF stands is that the Biden administration had said, we're not interested in CPTPP, we're going to do IPEF and there are benefits to this. First, because we're showing to the region we want to be engaged, and that's certainly a benefit. But second, because since Congress is not going to be involved, negotiations will be faster. Since market access will not be part of the equation, it will be more politically palatable. Well, turns out it's not going to be that way because the negotiations will take longer, because Congress is not happy about being marginalized, and they've already sent signals that they expect to be part of the process. And also because even if market access is not in the equation, there are other provisions like labor standards and digital economy that are now generating pushback. And in an election year, there's no willingness to test the waters of dividing the democratic base. So, what's Plan C? I mean, I wish I knew, but I think that's what we're asking ourselves. Now, where can we work together? I think that the supply chain, rapid response, early warning systems, that's part of IPEF, is very good. I actually think in IPEF, it might be harder to really get it to work because it means that companies have to be, and governments have to be willing to exchange a fair amount of very, very important information to bring transparency to their supply chains. And it's a very diverse group of countries operating with a soft cooperation platform. I actually think that the initiative that has more chance to develop a more robust early warning system on supply chain resilience is the trilateral one between Japan, South Korea, and the United States, where there is now, at least for the time being, a political commitment to coordinate more closely on their Indo-Pacific strategies, which includes economic supply chain resilience. Now, one word, I know I'm going too long, Frank, just give me 2 seconds to end here, but on the economic security, I think that there's a lot of room for cooperation. I said I would end on a high note. I have a little bit of downer at the end, but First, the good news is that there's a lot of convergence between Japan and the United States on economic security. Japan is going to be disappointed on trade. I have no questions about that. But on economic security, I think that there is a shared understanding or shared concern about the challenge that China poses, a willingness to try to protect core technologies, to try to diminish overdependence on China. And I think that, Japan already has come on board to these export controls on semiconductor production equipment, and more can be happening. Now, so that's all very good. I think that critical minerals could be a very important area of cooperation. And I really recommend Kyla's note on the critical minerals trade agreement. But so that explains really well what transpired. My worry is that the U.S., has used the IRA to then create a need for countries to negotiate these, free trade agreements that are free trade agreements in name, because they're not comprehensive, because they don't have market access commitments, and because they're, again, soft language, not binding. I would prefer that the United States and Japan had a deeper critical mineral partnership where they think about joint investments, diversification, how we use our competitive advantages to think very serious about diminishing dependence on China. And finally, because economic security is, I think, the upswing for the economic cooperation agenda between the United States and Japan, I also think that there are stones along the road. And one is, I think, a concern that many have as to whether the United States friendshoring, does it mean onshoring? And this matters greatly to our partners. And I would say that the pushback against the announced acquisition by Nippon Steel of U.S. Steel is going to be a very important signal as to where the U.S. can distinguish rival from friend, and what are the criteria for welcoming these type of investments into the United States. So there's a lot that these countries can do together, but even in the areas of cooperation, they have to coordinate and sort out these issues as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Mireya. In Washington, we always start these roundtables talking about geopolitics and national security, and then we move to econ security, and then if there's time left at the end, they talk about values and human rights. And you have successfully, with your fellow panelists, turned that on its head this afternoon. And I appreciate your reminder that economic security is now national security. There's a fusion there. And then we lead with the econ, not because of just reframing, but because of the reality of its importance as a driver of the geopolitics and what's happening in the region. So indeed, high politics and low politics. I think the low politics is the electoral stuff, but the high politics includes now the economic security. And that makes me think, are we going to see an emergence of a hub and spoke economic alliance system to complement the hard security alliance system? And if so, who's the hub of it? But I appreciate very much your balanced presentation. In terms of optimism, pessimism, look, Bob Scalapino, one of my former mentors, used to say that on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, he was an optimist. And on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, he was a pessimist. And on Sunday, he would rest. So today's Tuesday, so a little bit of down pessimism is probably okay. It's in keeping with Scalapino's philosophy of life. I want to say to our audience online, the chat box is open. If you have questions you'd like to try to pose to our panelists, let me start with just one to get the ball rolling. And we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. And I'll try to be brief in the questions and appreciate concise answers also. But in terms of the difference between friendshoring and onshoring and the critical minerals issue, are we at risk here of papering over significant practical challenges in achieving greater supply chain resiliency and independence from China? What I mean is, it's very nice to talk about friendshoring, but the reality of this is that you may be picking winners or losers. It matters whether the factory is in Arizona or Hokkaido to build those chips in terms of the jobs and who benefits. And I'm not sure that many Americans, until the supply is disrupted, I'm not sure that many Americans give a darn about whether that chip in their car came from China or Japan or Taiwan or the Netherlands or someplace else. So how do we implement friendshoring? Can we tease that out a little bit? Maybe all three of you, a little bit more about the mechanics of this. What does it look like? I don't know who would like to start. Maybe Mireya.
Well, I think that friendshoring, it's not just an end on itself, right? I think it's about promoting supply chain resilience. It is about addressing critical vulnerabilities. And it should be about, I think, and sometimes I wonder if this is front and center, promoting sustaining economic competitiveness. And achieving all of these goals with one formula is very difficult. But you need to start with realistic expectations. I think that some of the issues that the Inflation Reduction Act, with its tax credit system and this complicated, very demanding standards for phasing out, critical minerals and batteries from entities or foreign entities of concern, is that it doesn't really match the reality on the ground of where these industries are, where they stand, and how can they remain competitive by sourcing, efficiently from abroad. So you can, and then this ends up hurting the green transition agenda too, because very few automobiles, Kyla must know this better than I do. I think 13 out of 50 models or something like that qualify for the tax credits, something like that.
Shrink, right?
Yeah. So, you do want to encourage the consumer to buy that EV vehicle, but then by imposing all these restrictions, which also require a lot of monitoring and tracking the sourcing and all of that, you end up making your industry not very competitive. And then you end up thinking, well, what about Chinese EV vehicles? They're going to be far more competitive. Then you end up increasing the tariffs so that they cannot reach your market. And you're talking about making the United States a very high cost location of production, as opposed to making the US the best economic power that it could be. So there are trade-offs everywhere. That's just one. The other one I would mention is that friendshoring in many ways runs counter the principle of multilateralism and of the WTO, and how you divide these rules without breaking those rules. Because if you break them, others are going to break them. And are we going to like it when we are the ones excluded? And this is not only China, it can be our own friends and partners. So if everything goes, then and WTO rules become paper, we also end up paying a huge price. So that's one side of the equation. Just to end here, I do believe that we should be mindful of where the choke points are as much as we can. We should be thinking that we should not just allow the principle of efficiency to be supreme. There should be a balance with risk management. But if we're going to be telling our partners that their investments are not welcome because they're about an iconic firm, then that sends a message that this is not really about national security. It feels more, again, like economic nationalism.
Thank you. Others to weigh in on this point?
I guess just to build off of Mireya's points regarding, the electric vehicle tax credit. So with the Inflation Reduction Act writ large, just one point that, the EV tax credit requirements were also paired with, production credits incentivizing, manufacturing in the United States. So as we're talking about this friendshoring aspect, there is also these incentives to onshore manufacturing. On the foreign entities of concern provision, that's a provision that prevents the inclusion of parts, minerals from countries like China, North Korea, Russia, Iran. The definition of what they mean by that is something that's been really key. Some guidance came out in December to be implemented on January 1st. So it's a very, very tight timeline. So it does appear that there might be some room for Chinese invested firms in third countries, for example, to take part in this supply chain. But I think that remains to be seen in practice. And that has major implications when we're thinking about sourcing from countries, key sources of minerals, for example, Indonesia, right? Argentina, Malaysia, the Philippines, India. So that's one thing to keep in mind. I think the point about negotiating various different critical minerals agreements is another important one. Right now, we're engaged in negotiations with the EU and the UK. You may see in the press that the talks with the EU, there are some difficulties there, that they're facing a different situation perhaps than the negotiations with Japan. And just a broader point about the IRA EV tax credit, this was passed under budget reconciliation. So it is a 10-year tax credit. And we're talking about shifting of supply chains, getting factories online, getting mines together. And that's a project that takes over a decade, right? So that's just one thing to keep in mind when we're talking about supply chains. Okay.
Yeah, just quickly. So I think one side, it's how business kind of logic would trump over economic security or vice versa. So the business has value chains and their human capital kind of considerations and all that is one thing. The other thing maybe is that if friendshoring is done partly with China in mind, where coalition building is also an important part. If the US is behaving very self-serving, then that might not work as well. So maybe there's another rhetorical or political, kind of thinking behind it.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So the floor is open for questions from those in the audience. Please just state your name and then any question that you have. Who would like to start? Please.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm Makana from Georgetown University in IBM. I have a question about the economic cooperation, especially focusing on cross-border data transaction between US and Japan. In 2019, the G20 summit, the Japan and G20 countries have agreed on the data free flow with trust, which is ensuring the free flow of data among G20 countries while prioritizing, ensuring the trust, which is a little bit vague concept, unfortunately. In my perspective, the G7 has been making progress for these years that they are trying to deep down the detail on how they can operate, prioritizing what kind of the data and what kind of peers among G7 countries. But to me, the G20 has not been making progress on the further implementation of the DFFD. And then my personal view is that for sure because of the peer competition among the Western countries, non-like-minded countries. But I'd like to know your opinion about how the US and Japan consider the strategy of further implementing the data free flow with trust or cross-border data transaction, especially along with the situation of peer competition. Maybe also the rise of the generative AI, which may also have to consider the alignment between the free flow of data, but at the same time the expansion or the implementation of generative AI across the nation. So yeah.
It's a great question. My cynical worldview is that the United States embraces international rules when we're worried that we're not dominant in a sphere, and the U.S. tends to back away from international rulemaking when we're enjoying hegemony over whatever the issue might be. And it goes to this question about why we haven't made progress on the data component of IPEP. But who would like to take this excellent question about G20 and data flow and trust, what the prospects are? Where you want to start? Yeah.
Sure. I think that in the US, this issue of the digital economy has touched a chord in the sense that some people have made the point, those who have supported the suspension and, not moving forward with the traditional position on digital trade diplomacy, that these rules were there just to favor the big tech companies and that they leave out the small and medium-sized enterprises. But I actually think that, small and medium-sized enterprises need the digital economy as much as the tech giants. And, there are a number of agreements out there, like the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement negotiated by Singapore and other countries that do make a point of digital inclusivity, capacity building, and making sure that small and medium-sized enterprises are part of digital economy. And I asked myself, why cannot we just shop around and see that there are ways in which some of these measures could be incorporated in a robust digital economy push with funding for capacity building? One of the things that makes the other pillars of IPEP attractive is the idea that there will be some kind of funding. We haven't seen exactly how much. We haven't even seen the text of those pillars. But nevertheless, neither Japan nor the United States has gone too deeper. But I think that the idea is intriguing and certainly shows that some countries are thinking creatively about this. Now, the other question that these pause raises, and I think goes to the heart of your question, is that it's not happening in a clean slate. I mentioned two trade agreements where the United States had these very robust digital economic principles, but they have also have made this progress, that these negotiations that you mentioned on the G7. And what was interesting is that I don't think there's a lot of good internal coordination here in the United States, because when USTR was saying we're pressing the pause button, I think that G7 ministers were meeting, talking the traditional language of freedom of data flows, and it's very confusing, and we don't know where we're heading. The problem is that, again, we know that other countries like China have, want broad national security exemptions, have surveillance states, and have a very different approach to the digital economy. So if we choose not to play or not support Japan in its Freedom of Data Trust initiative, there is a trade-off there. The question for Japan is how you define trust. That has always been the issue with this initiative, but I think it's a better effort to try to think creatively than to say we need policy space and be standstill.
Not much on this point. So,
Sensei. No.
It's Stanley Kober. We're talking about U.S.-Japan economic cooperation, but we're not the only ones who have economic cooperation. Today, the BRICS is clearly anti-American in terms of its economic policy. The IMF has been warning about economic fragmentation. The oldest dividing now two competing economic alliance. If that is the case, and it does seem to be that way, what does the future look like?
Thank you, Stanley. Right to the
It's Tuesday, right?
It's Tuesday. It must be Tuesday. Yeah. So, look, we've seen the glimmers, right? The tariffs and the resilience of tariffs, the national industrial policies, which could be fostering competition and openness, but don't have to be, and have a strong inclination often not to. And then you've got this sentiment in Congress right now about China, where a presidential candidate talking about 60% tariffs on goods from China doesn't cause alarm and shock and horror, right? It's sort of met with, okay, yeah, maybe. Are we seeing a Cold War economic system emerging, Katada-san?
So again, my professor hat on is that, I'm actually reading quite a bit on the 1920s and 1930s literature now. And, this world now look increasingly like not the Cold War, but more like the interwar years, where nobody's putting in the public goods needed. The open trade, the rules-based order, kind of investment that's needed. And maybe at this point, this is the environment, sustainability, all those. And, obviously, US has been the one shouldering significant part of it, starting 1945 forward, while, during that time, UK couldn't and US was not willing. And now the US unwillingness is like the world looking more like it. And in some ways, Japan's quiet leadership is the one that's, that and others, obviously, who has significant stake in kind of keeping this system intact, or at least kind of going for the time being, is the one that is sustaining it. On the other hand, obviously the frustration from the other side of this order not serving them or challenging it to have an alternative way. The BRICS, which started in 2009 as a summit, and now quite a few are joining and kind of putting this as an alternative way of thinking about the world. So I don't have a crystal ball, but the concern is that is the type of world that we might be looking at. I would say it's more so rather than the kind of the Cold War 2.0.
Kitamura-san, I don't want to put you on the spot with your bosses on Capitol Hill, but when you interact with members and staff in Congress, what's the sense you have about their appetite either for trading blocks versus their interest and commitment to continuing to expand a rules-based order that would be inclusive and open? We talk a lot about the free and open Indo-Pacific. We don't talk about the free and open, but partisan, aligned, highly regulated. I mean, what are you hearing on Capitol Hill in terms of the appetite for globalism?
That's a really interesting question. You talk about trading blocks, versus. I think there is a lot of recognition that we need to trade, right? And I know there's a lot of interest expressed publicly in how to push that agenda forward. And I think, based on the statements members are making, they're trying to find that policy space where that can happen. So I think, as we've all talked about, the blocks policy maybe is more politically difficult right now. So I think there is an interest in identifying key partners, Japan being one, for example, with whom we can pursue positive policy agendas. So I think you do see that interest. It's just a matter of finding perhaps that policy space.
And maybe the Camp David Accord and the U.S.-Japan ROK offers some glimmer, arguably, of optimism in that it's a push to expand the like-minded groups of nations that are going to support the rules-based international trading order rather than to further subdivide or further constrict that space.
Frank, we should not lose sight of the mega trade agreements, like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership or the CPTPP, because that is the one way in which you can still have pockets where rules-based trade applies when you don't have this fragmentation of us versus them. China does belong to the RCEP. So that's why it's not so clear cut. I think we see economic nationalism and mega trade agreements coexisting.
Yes, that's a glimmer of optimism on a Tuesday. I think we have time for one more question from the floor. If someone has a question they'd like to pose to our expert panel, please.
Thank you very much for the insightful discussion. I have a question about how Japan, US, and the EU can cooperate in terms of economic security. So US and Japan has been working together in economic security for the past 3 years, but the EU is also pushing for great de-risking or economic security. So, and there has been some cooperation between US, Japan, and the Europe country, especially the Netherlands, in manufacturing. But what would be the other areas that those 3 countries or groups of countries can cooperate?
One thing that I've been hearing is that anti-economic coercion is the area. G7 had kind of somewhat of the kind of agreement or declaration, and I think EU side they are working towards. I think there's a summit is in Italy next time, and towards that kind of initiative. So they do see. Europe has had share of economic coercion imposed on them, and they have a relatively close view about that with the US and Japan. So I think that's an area, even though, in what form, I don't think we have any clear shape yet.
I think that's a great question. I think that one of the problems is that the United States has different mechanisms and dialogues to, talk about economic security cooperation, but it has one pipeline is with Europeans, another one is a Quad, another one is a trilateral. And it's important to make sure that there is consistency and that effort can be aggregated wherever possible. So in addition to economic coercion, I think another area where there could be a lot of cooperation is on export controls. My position has been that it's important to move beyond, unilateral export controls with extraterritorial application and try to elicit, just go beyond the bilateral and build a plurilateral, wherever possible, export control regime that where there should be genuine input from our partners. And this includes, of course, understanding the U.S. concerns about China's technology practices, which are shared by the other partners, but also think through how you can be really narrowed and focused and stay true to the principle of small yard, high fence. And that could include, for example, ideas about how you delist items. Because the way I think of it is that export controls are just expanding, but it's important to think about products, technologies that are mature, that are no longer essential, and therefore should be delisted. So that, I think, would be far more effective if you have a large set of countries that have similar goals.
It's just one thing to add briefly is critical minerals could be another area of cooperation. Separate from the critical minerals agreement discussions, perhaps there are other forums like the G7 or that mineral security partnership where there's a lot of shared interest in securing these materials that are really key for the green transition, which is also a key priority for the EU.
Well, I want to thank the panel for making me feel antiquated. I wrote my master's thesis on why the U.S. should abolish the coordinating committee, COCOM, with respect to export controls on China 40 years ago. And now we are hearing the benefits of plurilateral export control regimes maybe needing a reintroduction as preferred to ad hoc arrangements. What a world we have lived through in terms of change. This program would not have been possible without the support of the Embassy of Japan, but more importantly, without the excellent staff work of Associate Director of Programs Saori Katada, Program Manager Julianne Dosher, and Director of Communications Tim White. Please join me in thanking our staff at the Mansfield Foundation. The lunch was from who, Tim? Who provided? Kaz. So if you like the bentos, frequent Kaz.
They're on I Street.
On I Street, yeah. and thanks to our interns also at the foundation for helping with all the setup. And I appreciate so much today's conversation. I learned a lot. I hope you all learned a lot as well. We have not by any means exhausted the issue, have we? So we may have to have a end of year recap and reassemble this group and take stock of what has happened in 2024 post-election, maybe. We'll maybe try to reassemble the wisdom to take stock of what has happened and what hasn't happened over the course of the next 12 months. Thank you so much for joining today's program. We are adjourned.